Jains there, everyone. Give me just one moment to share my screen. And I first want to say that I really appreciate everyone taking the time to be here today. I promise that this presentation isn't very long because I know that we've been here for some time. So give me just a moment. Okay. Can you see that okay? Great. So Jains there, everyone. My name is Hetali. As Hetzel said, I'm a former YJ board member and a member of both the Jain Society, the Jain Study Center of North Carolina, and the Jain Society of Greater Detroit. I recently finished graduate school studying law and education, and I'm hoping to do civil rights work long term. I really want to say thanks to the YJ board for creating this space for discussion. I think as a community, many of us are feeling a lot of energy right now and a lot of desire to understand and be involved, but we're not quite sure where to start. And I hope that some of the ideas that I introduced today can help you with figuring out how you want to take action. But I want to start with two disclaimers. The first is that I'm not an expert on these issues. I'm really lucky throughout graduate school to have had the chance to study some of these concepts in depth and apply them in my work, but that doesn't compare to the scholars, the policymakers, and the activists who have spent their careers doing this work. I'm constantly learning from them, and I encourage you to do the same. I also want to say that spending 15 or 20 minutes with me here and learning is great, and I'm glad you're here, but I encourage you to think about this as a first step in an ongoing process. Combating racism and inequality is something that has to continue long after this particular moment in time, just like our practice of Jainism does. It's work that we have to engage in continuously over the course of our lives. So let's start with something very basic. What is racism? I would love to hear if you're comfortable sharing what your understanding of that term is in the chat. You can share any words or phrases that come to mind. It could be anything that you know about it. There are not wrong answers here. So prejudice, discrimination, thinking you're better than other people, unfair treatment, being against a group of people, and thinking you're superior. All of these are absolutely a part of it. Thank you for sharing. So there's not necessarily agreement among scholars on one definition of racism, and I'll offer these two. The first is a dictionary definition, a belief that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race, and the other is a combination of prejudice and institutional power. What I hope you notice is that both of these are more than just bad feelings towards someone because of their race. It's also about thinking that someone is better than someone else, or about power being used to benefit one group of people in a way that hurts another group of people. So I'll say more later on, but I'm sure you're already able to think about some of the ways in which you might have experienced racism yourself, and some of the reasons that Jainism might say that racism is not okay. You might have also recently heard the term anti-racism, and you might be thinking, well, if I don't want to be racist, what's on the other end of the spectrum? Again, there's no one definition, but I'll offer one from a recent book by scholar Ibram X. Kendi, which is that to be anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of the racial groups. And then the question becomes, what are the actions, ideas, policies, and behaviors that follow from that? So this definition also has two parts, a belief and an imperative to take action based on that belief. Kendi says that this is different than being not racist. If you're not racist, you might not be committing the violence, but you might be allowing it by omission. Being anti-racist means taking action to stop the violence that's happening around you. And if all of this feels a little abstract, I wanted to give you some examples of what it looks like when racism, when a combination of prejudice and power plays out in our society. So these are other terms that you might have heard before, but not totally understood. The first is systemic inequality. So imagine these ideas about some races being better than others existing not just within individuals, but within the broader fabric of society, in the policies of government, in the way we distribute social services, in our companies and our workplaces, and so on. This could be in the form of laws that discriminate against a particular group of people, or it could be the result of historical practices that have had long-term side effects. I'll give an example later. Another is microaggressions. If systemic equality is at a societal scale, microaggressions are in our day-to-day interactions. So if anyone's ever made an assumption about you based on your racial identity, or said things to you like, but where are you actually from? Or do you speak Hindu? That's a microaggression. Stereotyping is a related idea, thinking that all people from a race look the same, or act the same way, or have the same good or bad qualities. And the last of these three probably feels very concrete to us as Jains. Racism leads to violence in thoughts, words, and in actions. And we've seen some of that in the past few weeks. All four of these concepts are interrelated and they really build on each other. And again, understanding how and why is a continuous process. I just wanted to double check. Are y'all good on recording? Sweet. So I'd also like to provide some starting points for further understanding racism in the United States. I know there's a lot of parents who are here and it's so great to see you, particularly if you didn't grow up here or take a history class here. There's a lot of context and background information to this issue that I could only begin to scratch the surface of today. So instead, I'll offer two examples that hopefully drive home one main point. Although any group that is marginalized can experience racism, in the United States, it has profoundly affected the Black community. And I want to quickly note that many of you might have learned at some point or assumed that it's better to say African American. Something that I've learned is that particularly when speaking about racial issues in the United States, Black is more accurate specifically as opposed to African American because it encompasses individuals who are also African immigrants who are facing racism in this country. So the first I'll point out is the origin of organized policing in the United States. The first organized police forces were created in the South in the early 1700s to monitor slaves and catch runaway slaves. So while other parts of the country where slavery was less prevalent had volunteer neighborhood watches or people just relied on private security, organized policing was really created to monitor and police the Black population. The second is redlining. So you might have heard that term. In the early 1930s, a federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation was charged with making maps of cities that outlined where it would be low risk versus high risk to offer loans and mortgages. And these maps physically delineated cities, outlining in green areas that were most desirable and red the areas that were highest risk. So redlining. And there's an example here. This is Durham, North Carolina security map that was made in 1937. So neighborhoods outlined in red were often what we would call quote unquote inner city neighborhoods, and they were usually predominantly Black. Private real estate agents and banks would later use these maps to steer Black families away from certain neighborhoods or to make it impossible for them to get loans. So overall, redline communities tended to get less investment, resulting in lower property values, which meant that those communities couldn't collect as much money in property taxes. Well, property taxes fund things like schools, social services, and everything else that you need for a safe and happy and healthy community. So this is what I want to point out as an example of that earlier concept of systemic racism. This didn't require, and no one says that everyone along the way in this process was overtly racist, but the system that they were operating in was, and it led to an inequitable outcome that has effects even today. So with that background, I want to briefly touch on a connection I see between these issues and Jainism, and that is rooted in compassion. So Mahavir Bhagwan said that we are all equal, and he specifically spoke out about the kinds of discrimination that were prevalent in India at the time of his life, caste and gender. His redefinition of the fourfold community of the Sangh specifically expanded our Jain Sanghs to include Sadhvijis and to include lay women. And Jainism adapts, right? We're taught that we have to take Jainism's teachings and apply them to the time that we're in. So how do we adapt that concept of nonviolence and compassion to the discrimination that we see around us today? How can we be compassionate towards our fellow humans in this time? And I hope that some of what I've said has given you the sense that this work of combating racism starts with learning and starts with engaging in dialogue. Anti-racism applies to our relationships, not just with the Black community, but with all people. And we have a tool for that in Jainism, which is Inequality, or wanting to understand and seek out a multiplicity of views. So I'll give you that food for thought as a question. What spiritual responsibility do we have to learn more about what's going on around us? What spiritual responsibility do we have to engage in these conversations to understand how we can be compassionate in our world as it is today? And another way of thinking about engaging in that spirit of compassion is encapsulated by a term that you might have heard in the past week, which is being an ally. So I've put some ideas here on this slide. I won't go too in depth other than to say if you've seen calls to be an ally or act as an ally, this is a good definition of what that involves. And I'm hoping that you can do some reflection on how these actions fit in with your understanding of compassion and of Jainism. So I'd like to close out by thinking about two words that you've also probably heard used a lot in the last few days and few weeks: equality and equity. So I'd love to hear in the chat, what do you think is the difference between those two words, equality and equity? Does anyone have any ideas or suggestions? So equality and equity are the two words. Yeah, not sure. So something to do with equal rights, maybe thinking about the outcomes, the end goal versus the means, equal access, the same versus equal opportunities. Yeah. So equality, as you can see from this first picture, is treating everyone the same, right? Or giving them the same things. And hopefully this graphic also conveys why sometimes that doesn't quite cut it to achieve what we want in our society. Equity, by contrast, says that we want to achieve a particular outcome where everyone has equal opportunity. And as you can see, that might mean that a person needs more of our support or our love or our resources or our compassion than another, at least until some societal structures or barriers are more fundamentally changed. And at the end of the day, that's probably where we're trying to go, is liberation. A space where everyone has the ability to be their desired personal and spiritual self and pursue those goals. Mahavir Bhagwan said that every living being is equal. What I'll propose to you as an understanding of that is that every living being being equal is not the same thing as saying that every living being should be treated equally. It means that we are all equally deserving of dignity and compassion and respect. And the kind of society where every living being is equal is, in fact, an equitable society. So I promised I would leave you with a few extra resources because we can't do all of this in 15 minutes, and here they are. I think these slides will be shared afterwards as well. If you start here, you'll find more, and I encourage you to take it one step at a time. This may all be very new and it may be uncomfortable, but plenty of things are when we learn about them or learn how to do them for the first time. And I think it's perfectly okay to say, I don't know, and it's okay to admit that there are ways in which we are always learning. So what do I do now? I've seen this question a lot in the past few days, and here's 3 ways of taking action that I want to offer. The first is to participate yourself, right, with your body. There's a lot going on now. Protests look different in every city, and of course, we are still in the middle of a pandemic. So you have to decide on a mode of participation that feels right for you and that aligns with your values. And if you don't feel comfortable going outside, but you want to be involved, the people who are protesting need things like water and snacks and supplies. If you find the groups organizing in your local communities, you'll probably find a number of ways that you can be involved. And if you click on this photo later on these slides, there's a great video from the CNN town hall yesterday with Elmo and his dad talking about what it means to protest. This was my first time finding out Elmo has a dad. If it's yours too, I understand. But it's a really great primer. A second way to participate is by giving your money. So I've listed 2 organizations that I've given money to here. The first is Reclaim the Block, which does policing reform advocacy work locally in Minneapolis and in Minnesota, where protests started. And the second is Integrated Schools, which works to create more equitable K-12 public schools. I think there's two buckets of need to think about: short-term and long-term. So there are organizations doing important short-term relief work right now to help those who are protesting or who are really immediately in need. And there are long-term organizations like these two that are working on systemic reform projects that will go on long after protests are ended. I think before giving money, you have to evaluate whether the work an organization does aligns with your own values. And I would also encourage you to think about what balance of short-term and long-term work you want to support. And if you're overwhelmed with the options, just start in your local community. See who's doing work there where you are right now. And the third action I'll offer is to use your voice. I went to a really great voter training hosted by We All Vote last week, and I've linked some of the resources on this slide. You can also get to them through that QR code about getting the vote out in the South Asian community. Using your voice can also mean writing to your local elected officials about changes you want to see or signing petitions. And something underlying all of this is to keep learning, keep reading about these issues, keep becoming more informed, and use that learning to guide your actions. This work, anti-racism work, is not something that ends tomorrow or next week or whenever protests end. I would encourage you to use your existing communities, your friends, your Jains and YJ spaces to keep continuing this conversation. To that end, we're going to be posting a thread on YJ Reflect right after this conversation where people can share resources that they found to be helpful or impactful. So that group is on Facebook, and the link is here if you aren't in it yet, so I would encourage you to go there. That's about it. Once again, I really want to say thank you to YJA for the space to speak about this topic. And lastly, if you're interested in being involved with these issues more in your own life or potentially in your Jain Sangh, I want to invite you to join a loose, informal group of other young Jains that's came together about a week ago and have started to talk about how to bring this conversation to our communities. So if you fill out the form that is linked on this slide, we'll get in touch with you. And lastly, if I've said anything that was incorrect or that offended you, I humbly ask for your forgiveness, Michamidugram, and thank you for taking this time today.
Thanks so much, Hetali, for that amazing presentation. We will now be turning to the discussion portion of the event. And our community, both knowingly and unknowingly, can contribute to these systemic issues. So it's obviously important for us to take a hard look inward and make the changes needed to be better members of society. This leads us into an open discussion on what we can do to enable change. And with that, we will now be turning it over to Harshita to explain the logistics of our discussion session.
Thank you, Hetali, and thank you, Vatsal. So our goal in hosting this session is to provide a platform for our youth and adults to engage with and learn from one another on how we can enact change as individuals and as an organization. Attendees will be broken out into small groups, and we will be sending you a series of discussion questions in a link in the chat. Please open this link before moving to your breakout rooms. We request that members respect each other's viewpoints and participate in and contribute to a constructive and insightful discussion. So in the chat, I've just dropped a link to Hetali's presentation, and at the end of the presentation, you'll find the link to the questions that we've provided for the discussion. So go ahead and feel free to open that, and then you will be sent to your breakout rooms.
Thank you, everyone. So we've now sent you all breakout room requests. So please first open the link in the chat for the discussion questions, move to your respective breakout rooms. If you'd like to be moved to another breakout room, please return to the main session and request to be moved.